artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
This is episode 257. If you've followed, pretty much any of our show, then you know we're not here to advocate or cheerlead for or against AI. We're here to find out the truth and how to be our best selves in a world reshaped by AI. When people take a unipolar position that AI is going to be wonderful or terrible or inconsequential, they end up painting themselves into a corner where that's the only story they can allow themselves to express. So for us to do our due diligence in exploring the dimensions of AI, today I am talking with Doctors Emily Bender and Alex Hanna, authors of the upcoming book, The AI Con: How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want, and also co-hosts of the live podcast Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, which cuts through the constant waves of AI hype. Emily is well known for coining the term stochastic parrots in a 2021 paper as a label for generative AI. Stochastic means determined by probability, and parrot is pretty obvious. She's a linguistics professor and director of the Computational Linguistics Laboratory at the University of Washington, and was among the inaugural Time AI 100. Alex is a sociologist who looks at how the data that fuels AI technologies exacerbates racial, gender, and class inequality. She is Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Applied Transgender Studies. Her resignation from Google's ethical AI team generated widespread attention for its sharp critiques of corporate racism. This week, we're going to talk about their intentions with the book, cycles of hype and the effects of hype, the dangers of uncritical use of LLMs, slow science, and academic institutional culture. So let's get into the interview. Well, Emily Bender and Alex Hanna, it's a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You. I'm going to talk about your book. And I've said many times on this podcast that an AI boom that only benefits some people or even most of them is not right. That if that vision of the future doesn't benefit everyone, then it's not one that I support. And that is my vision. Now, here comes your book. The AI Con: How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want. And it does not read like an inquiry. It reads like an ultimatum nailed to the door of the AI cathedral. So what was the effect, or what is the effect that you're going for? What dent are you trying to make on the world?
We are seeing a world just awash in AI hype. All of these false promises based on misunderstandings or missellings of what the technology sold as AI can do. And we are really concerned about the harms that ensue, both in the creation of the technology and when it is misapplied. And there are very few actually sensible applications of what's the core of the hype right now, the synthetic text extruding machines. And so we want the broad public to be informed as to what these systems are so that everyone can make informed decisions about how to use them and be well positioned to push back when they are being used on us.
I also wanted to say one of the things that we wanted to do is really pull back the curtain to try to understand and to try to inform people of what is happening when it comes to these media generation machines, really what's happening there, to really show them that there's no there. It is not some kind of magic or it's not some kind of sentience, but it is actually a technology that fits in a long line of technologies. And there are incentive structures and there are a certain set of people in which the benefits to them are accruing disproportionately.
Can we just get into what were the formative events in your lives that have steered you in this direction? What happened that caused any sort of epiphany that has resulted in this effort?
So for my part, I'm a linguist. I have been studying linguistics since 1992, and linguistics is the field that looks at how language works and how we work with language. And, I like to say I was minding my own business doing grammar engineering, which is a part of computational linguistics that's basically automating sentence diagramming. Really fun. Great way to spend one's time. But there started to be sort of more and more obvious downsides to the way language technology was being deployed. And I run a professional master's program in computational linguistics at the University of Washington, and it sort of landed on me to bring these considerations into our curriculum. So in the first part of 2017, I taught a class that has since come to be titled Societal Impacts of Language Technology, and that sort of led me into seeing, hey, actually, linguistics really has a lot to say in this moment. And the other sort of half of that was that I was learning about these things largely through social media and interacting with people on Twitter, RIP, including Alex, which is how we met.
And I can say the way that I came to this is that I'm a sociologist, and what I had originally been studying were social movements, and still study social movements as more of a side gig now, oddly enough. But one of the things that I developed in my dissertation was a language model, which was not these large language models, but it was a much smaller language model to do classification of whether news articles mention protest or not for the use for social movement scholarship. And so the more I got into that rabbit hole, the more I was understanding how models could be used for harm, notably surveillance and identification of activists. And that took me into the route of being hired to the ethical AI team at Google, in which I paid attention to a lot of things regarding data and the way in which data was constructed. And that led me to connect with Emily in this set of papers that we wrote on benchmarks and benchmark data sets and machine learning data.
I want to really deconstruct this notion of hype as carefully as possible, and so start at a fairly high level. Can you say what is most offensive about this to you? What line was crossed?
I always struggle with superlatives because then I have to figure out the ranking to answer the question honestly. But one moment for me in this was in 2019 when the Mueller report was released, US politics, of course. There were people in my field, I think jokingly, suggesting using language models to unredact it, right? And the thing is that the language models are trained either on next word prediction or what's sometimes called a masked language modeling task, where you drop out certain words in the sentence and then use the statistics as compiled so far to create a probability distribution over the words that might be there and the missing spots, and then compare that to the actual thing, right? So in a sense, a redacted text looks really tempting, right? That is just the masked language modeling task, except that we don't actually have the ground truth to compare it to. And if you were to put an unredacted, and I'm doing scare quotes here, just putting that out loud because I know this is an audio format, in scare quotes, unredacted version of the Mueller report out in the world, how long would it take for some news agency to pick it up as actual fact? Because we have scrupulous journalists, but we also have the other kind. And then what is happening to our information ecosystem? So I have been sort of upset about the impacts on our ability to find trustworthy information and to trust it when we find it, starting in about 2019 with what was maybe a joke. And now people are in all honestly saying, oh yeah, you could ask ChatGPT and get information. No, you can't.
It's kind of like why you can't use AI photographic interpolation techniques to process astronomical images that have chunks missing, because they can show you what would be most likely to be in the hole, but not what actually is in the hole, which might be a comet or another planet or something.
Exactly. If you're actually interested in what's going on in the world, then you need methods that get you to what's going on in the world, not interpolation, as you say. Alex, how about you? What got you most
This is a very
offended?
hard question to answer. I mean, kind of what elements of the hype were the most odious? I mean, I'll say what I ended up fighting a lot in when I was on the Google team. And a lot of that was around ascriptions of individuals, kind of personality traits to individuals, specifically around race and gender. And so something that we would continually fight and I think have to re-explain is you can't make an assessment of race or gender based on how an individual looks. You may make some assumptions, but that is a gender presentation, and you then have to map it into race and gender. And we see this in other kinds of areas, whether it's emotion recognition or identifying someone as a criminal or trying to do some kind of facial verification or facial matching. And so I found those to be incredibly odious types of claims being used in this space. I ended up teaching and still occasionally teach a class at UC Berkeley around this. It's called Data-Powered Infrastructure. And it's all about how technologies of sorting, technologies of classification can very readily become technologies of violence in terms of who doesn't get a job or who is targeted by a weapon system or who gets denied welfare benefits. And so technologies of classification have these very, very real world effects. And I think that thing where it's really, I mean, the facial description one, I think is probably the most damning of them, just because you're trying to tell something internal about a person from external traits.
Right. And I want to draw the distinction there between the hype that leads to misapplication and unjustified faith that leads to predictive policing, facial recognition misfires, and the hype that you introduced with, which is the hype that it does something that it really can't. And I want to ask, isn't that a self-correcting problem when people will eventually find out that it doesn't do the things that everyone says? Won't the bubble pop? I mean, remember, I think it was around the turn of the millennium, there was an enormously hyped event that was going to come of something that was going to revolutionize society, the very foundations of our humanity. And the announcement turned out to be the Segway.
I was wondering where you were going with that. Yeah.
I'm not overstating the case that they made, and it was this semi-smart two-wheeled scooter thing that you rolled around on, and which was popular in Silicon Valley circles for getting around for a while, but sank without a trace. In other words, if you audience haven't heard what I'm talking about, don't worry, you haven't missed anything. But isn't that what will happen if this is overhyped, that people will discover that it by themselves, it doesn't do that, and so they will put it aside?
Unfortunately, no, that doesn't seem to be happening. And I think I can draw some distinctions between the Segway case. And I was like, are we aiming for Y2K? Like what? The Segway, which I hadn't thought of in years. So beautiful example. So some distinction between that case and what's going on around AI. But first I want to say that the examples that Alex and I were giving were examples of not just misapplication, but it being sold as doing something it can't do, right? People selling language models as being able to unredact, or people selling image processing systems as being able to predict or label or classify people by gender, race, criminality, emotion recognition, all of these things. The problem is that with machine learning systems, you can get output that looks like it's doing that thing. So the person who is choosing to use the system, who might be incentivized to identify criminals, and then they have this piece of automation that labels certain people as criminals, from their point of view, it is working, especially if the people it's labeling are people that they would love to see as criminals. So I think that's one important difference.
And I would also say that there's kind of larger claims of the hype cycle, right? I mean, the kind of claims, and we've been through so many different hype cycles. And one of the ones that has come up a few times as I've visited universities is the MOOC, the multi-online massive online learning platform. And thank you for correcting me. I just completely forgot what the acronym stood for. And so a lot of them were like, well, MOOCs are coming. The modern university is just, we're going to lose all the need for instructors. And that didn't happen, right? And it's not like this stuff has gone away whole cloth. It's sort of been relegated. I mean, we still have our content management systems, our learning management systems. There's still videos, there's still online courses. But the idea that it was going to completely disrupt the university was really poorly founded. I think the problem is that we don't have this kind of clear sign of implosion, at least yet, or that might take a while. And I would say the other element of that is that there's so much investment in the current hype cycle is that it may be too big to fail, to resuscitate the term from the 2008 financial crisis, right? I mean, we've just seen so much investment going into this because it looks like these things are going to be revolutionary. But, we have the latest investment round around OpenAI, $40 billion coming to them, $30 billion from SoftBank. Huge investment. But when NVIDIA dips, when Microsoft dips, I mean, the whole market dips, right? So these are becoming huge parts of modern economies.
So people can be clear about what space you're carving out with the term hype. When we're talking about large language models, the thing that's got everyone's attention, are we talking about the application for generating a novel chocolate chip cookie recipe, summarizing a document? Is there a distinction you would draw between use cases that are okay, valid, and ones we should be avoiding?
So I have a talk that I give called ChatGPT, When If Ever is Synthetic Text Safe, Appropriate, and Desirable? And in that talk, I sort of work out what are some criteria that would have to be true for this to be a good use case for synthetic text extruded from something like ChatGPT. And the first two are just never satisfied. And that's like, well, you have to be able to do this in an environmentally non-destructive way and using a system that wasn't built with data theft and labor exploitation. We don't have those yet. So sort of maybe the Bloom language model, even that I think was a lot of scraping. I don't think they have a consentful opt-in. They just documented what data they have. So setting those aside, imagine we had a system that satisfied those criteria. Then the use case has to be one where either the veracity of the output doesn't matter, or you are really in a position to efficiently and thoroughly check that the information is correct. It has to be a situation where originality doesn't matter, so you're not running into problems of plagiarism. It has to be a situation where the biases that are going to be coming out of these systems either don't matter or can be identified and mitigated. And once you've put all of those criteria in, it's actually really hard to find a good use case. Certainly, if you have an information need and you're seeking information, then turning to a chatbot is a terrible idea because not only do you have no way to verify that it's true, right? You're the one who had the information need, but what you're getting out is sort of disconnected from its context. And so you're losing this chance to sort of situate it within the larger information ecosystem. So my answer is basically never.
You are both accomplished researchers and experienced at conducting research to inform your writing in ways that preceded the advent of AI. And yet, I've personally found the benefits of using it to shortcut that process. And I also have performed research and writing prior to the advent of AI. So speaking personally, I can say that there are many use cases for large language models, the benefit of which is undeniable to me. Like I have personally verified that myself. I am aware of and look a great deal at the ways in which unfettered faith in it causes problems, some of which, and I referenced self-correcting problems earlier. And so anything where a bubble would burst, I'm not too concerned about. But the ones I am concerned about are the cases where we get led down a garden path that we're not aware of. The possibility that we cease to perform critical thinking that would reveal that we have gone in that direction. It's something that's hard to illuminate, hard to find the ways in which that is being expressed. I wonder what your research has uncovered in that respect.
So I would like to push back a little bit about the use of LLMs in kind of research and science. And we spend some time in the book, especially thinking about the process of doing science. And I think there's some great work by some folks that we chatted with on our podcast, MJ Crockett and Lisa Masseri, who talk about a lot of the kinds of perspectives of thinking about what science is and what science has done. And a big theme of that is that doing research should be done in this community of practice. And that's actually one of the kind of most important elements of that. And some of the ways that LLMs operate is that they're shortcutting that either by not really engaging into the process of proper citational practice. In some of the worst cases, the replacement of human subjects with LLMs or called in silico samples, supplanting peer review by using tools to quote unquote read papers and not engage with them in any kind of serious manner. And kind of the worst case is the wholesale writing of elements of that. And so I want to push back a little bit at that just because I think the kind of framing of research, as these often are, as being useful tools, can ignore elements of that and also get into the place of, I think it's connected to these kinds of potentially going down the garden path types use cases in which we are not thinking critically or not even going to be in a situation where we can evaluate the outputs of these sufficiently. So I think those are connected.
I think it's, again, one of those cases with AI, it's a very what I call spiky phenomenon, that there are the like hallucinatory effects. I know that's not a term you're enamored of. We can talk about that in a minute. But for the audience's understanding of hallucinations, when AI says it's right and it's wrong, these can be very spiky in terms of you can fall into that hole, but next to it might be a way that AI performs usefully. And so certainly in conducting primary research, that would be you do a study, you make measurements, you draw conclusions. You wouldn't want to use AI, or shouldn't be using AI to do that process. And as you alluded to, you shouldn't be using it especially to act as a substitute for human subjects. But when I'm doing research into finding out things that have already been known, I can ask AI for citations. Sometimes they're wrong, but I can check them. That is a lot quicker process for me than Google. And so it's accelerated my learning in many respects, just that I have applied a lot more critical analysis to it than I see many other people doing, unfortunately.
Like the lawyers who take this stuff. And yeah, I mean, it happened again. Like just in the last couple of days, there's been another example of a lawyer getting in trouble for this. And the California Bar Association using so-called AI systems to create some of their exam questions, like the people you'd expect to know better. I guess I want to say, first of all, I need to take issue with phrases like the advent of AI or ask the AI. And this is something that we do in the book, is we say, look, artificial intelligence is a marketing term. It doesn't refer to a coherent set of technologies. The synthetic text extruding machines that are sort of at the heart of the current hype cycle and often getting called the AI are just synthetic text extruding machines. And advent also is a word that brings in a lot of connotations about, like, first of all, religious connotations, and secondly, a major change in the world. So I wanted to sort of name all of that. But to say, if you are using a system like ChatGPT to get citations because you have a question and because it is difficult to find these things on Google, it is, first of all, yes, definitely, if you are going to be doing that, important practice to then go look up the thing and read the actual thing instead of just taking the output as an accurate description of it. But also, you can never see what it is that wasn't surfaced. And the underlying training data for ChatGPT is obscured and opaque, and all of the steps that have happened since are obscured and opaque. And so I really think that there are useful skills that aren't, something that are sort of at the core of becoming an academic researcher, but something that anybody could benefit from in terms of learning to use not Google in general, but more specialized search interfaces that you can get, for example, by talking to a librarian, or a step or two down from that, something like Semantic Scholar or Google Scholar, and learning how to navigate through the connections between bibliographies. All of that is valuable. And every time we instead turn to the chatbot, we are sort of losing a learning opportunity. And sure, sometimes there's not time to do the learning, but it is one of these things that has long-term benefits to sort of learn what the tools are. And if it's information access, then really the best first place to go is the library, including public libraries. And one of the best ways to support our library system is to use it.
I would also add to that, and I appreciate that Emily highlighting the librarianship and trying to think about what it means as these intrinsically useful skills. I also want to point out that, especially in the social sciences and the humanities, these tools are, instead of coming back with a list of citations that you then have to verify, which many people don't verify, so already you have that layer. I mean, the citations that it is surfacing often are going to be the ones that are going to be the most common ones. They're not going to be the ones in which may be the ones that are most important to maintain citational justice. And citational justice is a term in which is highlighting the kind of citations to which maybe original ideas had been formulated, especially from Black and Brown people, especially Black women, and highlighting their contributions, but do not get sufficient citation. And so that is one thing that I think is very at risk. I don't think I've seen a study specifically on citational justice in LLMs, but from what we've seen with every other type of output from LLMs, it has tended towards those citations or those references, which are much more Western, white, and male.
So how do you make a difference in this direction? We're in a society that's driven increasingly by scarcity or perceived scarcity, especially of time. And that is nowhere perhaps more visible than in technology and in academia, publish or perish. So telling people to give up their electronic searches and go to the library seems like it would be met with derision among many of your colleagues. How do you get some purchase?
I like the phrase scarcity of time. I think that's a good way to put it. And I was immediately put in mind of Maxine Waters saying, reclaiming my time. And I think part of it is I do advocate for slow science, and I'm not alone in that, that if we are going to have a scientific practice that is inclusive and not only accessible to people who can just drop everything and sprint to a deadline, so that includes people who might have health situations where they just it's simply unsustainable or already obviously unsustainable that you can't pull 3 all-nighters before the deadline, or carrying responsibilities to family or community, right? If we want science that has space for people who need time, and we want science where there's time to really connect with the communities that the science being done might impact, then we have to break away from the publish or perish cycle. Or not even that, but like we have to increase the size of the MPU, the minimum publishable unit, and move away from, yes, I can spin this article up with a couple little experiments and submit it to that deadline that's a week away, to I'm going to take a longer term vision of what it is that I'm trying to do with my scholarship and have time to be a person and connect with my community, and if different, the communities that I'm studying it through that process.
And I would say that, I mean, this is kind of the nice thing about us being social scientists, and especially even computationally minded social scientists, is that I think it really makes us think about what it means to step back and engage with communities who are doing this work, not only kind of communities that we may be studying or working with, also people who are in community with as academic practitioners. And one thing we talk about in the book is we talk about the kind of move to AI in science is part of this larger move in academia to more massive casualization, the decline of tenure track positions, the publish and perish culture. Now we're in a place in which research dollars are being taken away or indirects are being reduced from sufficient amounts to support research institutions to this de minimis rate, which is not actually going to pay anybody sufficiently at the university. And so we're in this larger environment. And I think the important thing to view is AI in this view, or these text extrusion machines, are ways that play into this even faster sort of deadlines. And I think there's a vision, or even faster pace of science. And there's this vision that there's some way in which text extrusion machines can supplant that slower, more intentional sort of science that needs to be done, that kind of normal progress, that there's these research programs that need to be labored on, and there's this quote unquote normal science that philosophers of science talk about as things that need to be progressed upon. Accelerating that is not going to produce better science per se. It's going to produce things that are more science-shaped or look like experiments but are not rigorous or even that novel. And I mean, it's not just us saying this. I mean, before Jeff Hinton kind of lost his mind with the existential risk things, he was complaining about benchmark culture in computer science, that there's not really novel methodological results. It's kind of just rushing and trying to do better and make the benchmark number go up. So that slowness is very important.
So what does action on that front look like? Can you get universities and other scientific institutions to sign on to some sort of manifesto?
I think I haven't thought about the manifesto pass, but I think there is action that happens within all of the places where we evaluate the work of scientists. So if we're talking about peer review, within my primary professional organization is the Association for Computational Linguistics, and there has been a move to, for example, telling reviewers you may not require that a paper compare to so-called state-of-the-art models if those state-of-the-art models are closed and proprietary. So you can't reject on that basis. And you cannot require people to have cited things that were posted on the archive preprint server within a very close, I think it's like 3 to 6 months or something before publication date. So there's sort of moves there to shift the reviewing culture. And then the other place where we get evaluated is in hiring, tenure, and promotion decisions. And there it is possible to change the way the beans are counted, right? To actually value longer term coherent research programs over just sheer number of publications in these kinds of venues. And so these are the kinds of levers that I think we have access to within the academic sphere. External to that, who else has some power? One group is journalists who do an awful lot of valorization of this non-peer-reviewed sort of preprint culture research. And I think journalists have a role to play here in sort of being much more skeptical about these effectively company blog posts that are trying to do an end run around peer review and then feed into this cycle of, well, Microsoft has done all this, Google's done all this, you got to catch up.
I would also want to give a shout out to faculty and staff and graduate employee unions, so including the AAUP, who I think has become very, very strong and is growing in membership, especially opposing lots of actions of this presidential administration, but also in terms of advocating for faculty and staff working conditions, right? And also give a shout out. I'm part of the UC-AFT, which represents adjunct faculty and librarians, and a lot of that has to do with just the workload of these individuals, many of them who are researchers and want to be researchers, but have these huge class loads to do so, right? And so those are also strong mechanisms of thinking about changing institutional culture and changing the kind of pace in this peerish culture.
That's the end of the first half of the interview. The rest is next week. I know this viewpoint, this pushback, is different from what we usually explore and quite contrary to prevailing narratives in the business world especially. But that's what makes it most important to pay attention to what these very smart people are saying. More about that next week. I'll just add that one of my persistent myths, an unconscious assumption I've held since childhood, is that any problem worth being worked on is being worked on. That if a question lies unanswered in science or an issue lies unresolved in society, that academics have seen that and are working on it. It still seems like such a natural, obvious thing to me. Like that's literally why research exists, isn't it? And yet, like so many assumptions that wither like vampires when we turn sunlight on them, it's patently untrue. Or there's no reason that it needs to be true. Just because something needs to be worked on, and there are academics that can see that it needs to be worked on, doesn't mean that it is being worked on, because the funding may simply not exist. And that's especially true today with so much funding for basic research being yanked. Academics got to eat like everyone else. If we stop funding science where we can't see its practical application or ROI, then we've lost our way. That's one of the fundamental categorical imperatives of what it means to be human. In today's news ripped from the headlines about AI, researchers at METR, Model Evaluation and Threat Research, have determined that the length of task that AI can successfully complete with 50% success has been doubling approximately every 7 months for the past 6 years. This means AI is getting better at handling longer and more complex tasks at a fast rate. They predict that in under a decade, we will see AI agents that can independently complete a large fraction of software tasks that currently take humans days or weeks. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Emily Bender and Alex Hanna, when we'll talk about the dangers of uncritical naming, anthropomorphizing, Luddites and bespoke crafting, the effects of synthetic content on interpersonal communications, capitalism, and collective action strategies. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, It's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.